Okay, we are recording.
Oh, hold on. Let me put my recording pants on.
This episode of Trifles is brought to you by listeners like you, who support us on Patreon and Substack. To learn more, go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com.
Welcome to Trifles, a weekly podcast about the Sherlock Holmes stories.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Yes, the Greek interpreter interpreted, the Norwood builder built, and the Reigate squires puzzled, but there are so many other details to pick apart in the stories.
Pray, be precise as to details.
How many disguises did Sherlock Holmes use? What were the street Arabs? And how did he get information from his underground network?
You are very inquisitive, Mr. Holmes.
It is my business to know what other people don't know.
Scott Monty and Burt Wolder will have the answers to these questions and more in Trifles.
The game's afoot.
Episode 423, The Methods of Sherlock Holmes. Hello and welcome to Trifles, the Sherlock Holmes podcast where we get into the details in the Sherlock Holmes stories. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And Burt, what are you? Do you tend to be methodical in your methods?
I do tend to be methodical. I also tend to be probably whatever that word is that's associated with overly concerned about details, you know.
Forgetful?
That's it. That's it. Yeah, you say that again. What?
Uh-huh. Well, this is our first of the month episode, and in season 9, that means we are covering a Morley-Montgomery Award-winning article. We've made that commitment here to you, dear listener, in season 9 of Trifles. The Morley-Montgomery Award, just in case you forgot, is an award that is bestowed to a single article from the Baker Street Journal from any given year. It has been going on since the late 1950s. It was mothballed for a little bit in the 1980s, I believe, and then resurrected. And we have a whole treasure trove of archives to choose from. So we will be covering 12 of those award-winning articles. And the idea here is to introduce you to what stellar Sherlockian scholarship looks like. And in this episode, since the winter 2024 issue of the Baker Street Journal just dropped, and since the 2024 Morley-Montgomery Award-winning article is in that issue, we thought it would be appropriate to discuss here. What is the article? Who wrote it? Well, you'll have to stay tuned for that right after this brief housekeeping note. Wanted to remind you that you can sign up to support the show on Patreon or on Substack, whatever works for you. There we have additional content, bonus material for you. We have, actually, we're going to be dropping a bonus episode later this month, the first episode of Trifling Trifles. We've picked out some topics that don't warrant a full-length episode here, but that we were just considering, was bugging our minds, or maybe somebody asked us about. So we'll be introducing Trifling Trifles only to our supporters on Patreon and Substack. And of course, if you are a supporter, we enter your name in a drawing automatically every month for a free back issue of the Baker Street Journal. So make sure you go to patreon.com/trifles or trifles.substack.com to check out more information. And all of these links are in the show notes. Well, Burt, we enter the realm of the winter 2024 Baker Street Journal. First, I should note there's a lovely piece of art on the cover with Arthur Wantner and Lynn Harding as Professor Moriarty on the cover. It's a wonderful stylized color version of a screen capture or a still from the promotion of one of those Wantner films in the 1930s.
Yeah.
But
well, I must say I didn't recognize one. I saw it, but I didn't associate that with Arthur Wantner. But now that you pointed out, there you are.
That's him right there. But more importantly, what's inside the Baker Street Journal that's worthy of discussion?
Those words, yes.
Well, many words.
Anyway, yes. Well, we have a terrific paper by Michael Meer. Michael is a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. I actually had the opportunity to spend a little time with him during this most recent Baker Street weekend. He was invested as the Englische Hof, a lifelong Sherlockian, who describes himself as a Doylean, an Epicurean, and classical melomaniac. And when time permits, he practices law in Bern, Switzerland.
Now, how does one become a melomaniac?
Well, after a while, you weary of it. And I suppose you just become mellow in your acceptance of yourself, which is a good thing.
I'm more of a mediocre maniac.
Oh.
Yeah. I study the writings of mediocrities.
Mediocrities.
I think his philosophy is good enough.
Wasn't he the inventor of the paperback palimpsest? Yeah. Once we make the paper thinner, we'll sell 1 million of these things. Mediocrities said. Yeah.
Oh, but more about Michael's paper here.
He put pictures of togas on the cover of those books because, after all, he said that's what people are really interested in.
Toga. Yeah. Let's get back to our Morley-Montgomery Award-winning article here.
It's a terrific paper. It's the methods of Sherlock Holmes. And the reason we wanted to do this is, A, it's just the recent winner. So this is the 2024 Morley-Montgomery Award winner. But B, it's really remarkable in that, you get into the world of Sherlock Holmes and keeping green the memory and writing about Sherlock Holmes. And there's this constant feeling that everything has been done. But this is a major discovery about something that came as a general surprise to me, because I don't know that I'd ever heard about it before.
No.
And
we one of the things about Sherlockian groups is many times we enjoy quizzes at our gatherings, and they're of all types. They're very difficult ones. There's examination papers. There's different levels people have to pass at certain societies, etc. And some are just fun, right? But this, to your point, this was probably the earliest kind of Sherlock Holmes centered content quiz that I've ever seen.
Yeah, it would have to be, because it appeared in another one of George Noon's publications. George Noon's, of course, is the publisher of the Strand magazine, and we've talked about George Noon's before. He was quite an entrepreneur for his day, and before he founded the Strand magazine, he created another magazine that Americans would be familiar with in the context of Reader's Digest. There used to be, well, there may still be for all I know, Reader's Digest magazine, but Reader's Digest culled little bits and summarized larger stories and essays and things from publications all around the world. Well, George Noons did that in the 19th century in England with a magazine that he called, an English weekly newspaper really, called Tit-Bits. And it was in Tit-Bits, which ran concurrently with the Strand magazine. Tit-Bits went very well, and then the Strand magazine was started. That the Sherlock Holmes examination paper appeared in 1893.
And we should mention that we did mention George Noons previously on episode 163 when we talked about vegetarians in Victorian culture. And he actually he did open a vegetarian restaurant in London. It was unsuccessful, but this was part of, thanks to the money he was making on Tit-Bits. And its full title, we should just say its full title is Tit-Bits from All the Most Interesting Books, Periodicals, and Newspapers in the World. And he established it in 1881. And the readership was lower middle class or aspiring middle class. And, of course, he had jokes and short stories, anecdotes, competitions. and the like. And the competition part is kind of where we find ourselves here with this Sherlock Holmes examination paper.
Yeah, very much so. And these kinds of competitions were things that went on all the time. And interestingly enough, I wrote a letter to the editor of the Baker Street Journal back in 2021 or 2022 about one of these things, because what had happened was that he had a contest in one of his magazines. In 1883, the Tit-Bits contest for the best Christmas story. And one of the people who entered that was Arthur Conan Doyle. And Conan Doyle felt really done down by the outcome, probably because the actual winner was a young Army private who won by sending in a story someone else had written, because the rules didn't specify that the story had to be original. And that story had been published by Ward Locke 5 years earlier. So this was probably actually the first less than satisfactory connection between Conan Doyle and Ward Locke, 3 years before they bought The Study in Scarlet from him for £25.
And I'm not sure if the general public is aware of this, but Conan Doyle would go on to refine that story that he submitted to Tit-Bits in 1883. The original title was The Brown Carbuncle. And it may have catered to the humor of that kind of magazine, but it was not appropriate for publication.
Yes. Well, actually, that story was referred to by Julie McCurris back in the 2020 Christmas Annual. It was an exciting Christmas Eve. At least that's the one we think it was. And it's not really the best Christmas story in the world, but if you want to poke around, you can actually find it.
Yeah.
But anyway, these contests, and the prize for the contest was a house, the so-called Tit-Bits Villa, which became the property, I guess, of Private William Robert Mellish.
Can you imagine having that on your stationery? Tit-Bits Villa.
Tit-Bits Villa.
Well, we advance 10 years to 1893, more specifically October 7th, 1893. And at this point, we are only, 4 months into the Strand Magazine publication of Sherlock Holmes stories. The stories first appeared in June of 1893, or July of 1893, is that right?
Well, no, one of the things that I get, well, wait a minute, I guess you're right. Because I thought this ran during the memoir. No, it couldn't have run during the memoirs.
No, my apologies. 1891, June of 1891.
Yeah, there you are. And this is, this thing appears in Tit-Bits in October of 1893.
1893 is when the memoirs wrapped up.
Right.
Yeah,
so it was with the memoirs.
So we got very limited Sherlock Holmes stories to choose from. Of course, we have the two novels, A Study in Scarlet and The Sign of Four. And then we have the collected stories in the Adventures and the collected stories in the memoirs. And the editors offered this Sherlock Holmes examination paper, and 3 prizes were offered. The first prize was 5 guineas, second prize 3 guineas, third prize 2 guineas for the best answers to a number of questions as to the methods of Sherlock Holmes.
Now, just to underscore it, and you mentioned this earlier, this must be the very first appearance of a Sherlock Holmes-related quiz, similar to the ones that we're still doing today. And I had never heard of this before. And so here it is, and Michael is doing a terrific job digging into it. But also there's the background question of, well, wait a minute. This is in Tit-Bits, and George Nunes publishes Tit-Bits, but who wrote this? Who decided? Was this a work by the editor or by somebody else? Because there's no byline to it.
Yeah. And they noted that Mr. Conan Doyle, who has taken an interest in the competition, has been kind enough to send autographed copies of the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes to a number of the senders of the next best competitions. So this is interesting that Conan Doyle, of course, is paying attention to this publication. You know, it's not really highbrow reading, as we mentioned, but it is put out by his publisher. So it would seem that he would have a vested interest in seeing how the competition played out.
But he's described as just someone taking an interest in it. You know, isn't that interesting? And do we want to go into a couple of these questions that are asked?
Sure. There's 12 questions. A few of them have subsections, but just to give you an idea of the type of questions that are being asked here about the methods of Sherlock Holmes. First question. Given two doctors' houses of the same date, how to determine which has the larger practice? Do you know the answer to that one?
Oh yes. It's the depth the depth to which the parsley is sunk into the butter. It's the depth to which your footfalls have worn into the tread of the stairs of the busier doctor.
How did Holmes deduce from the soles of Watson's slippers that he had had a cold recently?
Yes, well, that's because he was warming his feet by the fire and unfortunately singed those leather soles.
He had been drying them, right? And gave himself a hot foot. And he saw the new label on the bottom, right? The manufacturer's label or the cobbler's label that had singed it. It hadn't been worn off yet, right? So. And let's do one more. How did Watson's pocket handkerchief prove that he had been accustomed to wear a uniform?
Oh, probably because he wore it in his sleeve.
Yes, that's exactly right. Why, you win a house.
Well, actually, the prizes here were money. Yeah. 5 guineas first prize, 3 guineas second prize, third prize, 2 guineas.
Okay. Well, we'll give you a guinea pig as a consolation prize. Kind of like, let's make a deal, you know.
Fabulous.
The goat.
You ferreted out the solution.
Yeah, I see what you did there. So the winner was Adam R. Thompson of Tufnell Park. And the editors said that the competition was a very successful one. As I said, Conan Doyle contributed some autographed copies of the memoirs. And again, as you said, it was presented anonymously, and to this day, the examiner remained nameless. And here, Michael makes a good case for identifying who the author of this examination paper was. Do you want to give it away now, or should we work our way up to it?
Well, we could work our way up to it. You know, maybe in a sentence or two.
Yes.
Why don't you do that?
Well,
I should just say one more thing here. One is that Michael points out in his paper that this was really a literary promotion. It's sort of like advertising, and that Conan Doyle never approved much about advertising, and that's true. I mean, at one point, Conan Doyle had written a letter to the Daily Chronicle, criticizing the chest-thumping practices of the novelist Hall Caine. And Conan Doyle wrote, "Surely in the case of another man, Mr. Caine would clearly perceive that it is for others to say these things, and that there's something ludicrous and offensive about them when they're self-stated." And of course, this is because Hall Caine was going out and essentially advertising that he'd written a fabulous novel. In my opinion, this is the best thing I've ever done.
Yeah.
And you better listen to me. So yes, Conan Doyle was not a fellow who was inclined to self-promotion, and that's certainly true.
No, but he was a fellow who appreciated healthy sales of his stories. So There's a financial incentive here for Conan Doyle to see that people are eating up the Sherlock Holmes stories. Now, Nunes, of course, didn't conceal the fact that the goal of this competition was to generate profits for his investors. It's pretty obvious. For example, in connection with that competition for the house, he informed the readers that there was no philanthropy about the matter. The competition was simply prompted by the advertising instinct. Right, so right there, you've got Nunes as a savvy businessman, a savvy promoter, looking to gin up interest in his publication. And the Holmes stories, of course, had attained such great popularity in the Strand that this allowed them to place before the readers, either of Tit-Bits or the Strand magazine, every one of the Sherlock Holmes stories which were worth reading again and again. Now, as you mentioned in Conan Doyle's view, and this is what Michael says here, self-promotion did not suit an author. And certainly with the success of the stories and his investment in Nunes, he became a literary businessman and had always been very conscious regarding the finances of himself and his family. Right? And remember, later on when Doyle quote-unquote retired from writing the Sherlock Holmes stories, he was lured back by Nunes with a very healthy check. Right? So Conan Doyle was certainly not immune to writing more Sherlock Holmes stories as long as it became financially worthwhile.
Well, and Michael, sort of caps this off by reminding us that, after all, that's probably why this piece was published anonymously without the name of anyone associated with it, because that would help Conan Doyle avoid this, self-promotion, which he didn't think was, the thing to do. So here's the nub of it. So Michael is researching Conan Doyle's visits to Switzerland and how he came to conceive of the death of Sherlock Holmes at Reichenbach. And as part of that, Michael studies the manuscript of Conan Doyle's lecture on fiction as a part of literature. And this calls to mind the recently published Conan Doyle on the Whole Art of Storytelling. Conan Doyle was a great lecturer on English literature and other authors and writing. But he gives this lecture, Fiction as a Part of Literature, in Lucerne on the 9th of August, 1893, a few days before visiting Reichenbach. And his lecture is in a lined notebook that's in the possession of the British Library. And the text of this is unpublished. And so any account of it, any knowledge of it, is only based on things that happened to be in the newspapers at the time. So there's Michael at the British Library reading the manuscript of Conan Doyle's lecture on fiction as a part of literature, which was given in Lucerne in Switzerland in 1893. And Michael says, it's an interesting read, giving insights not only into Conan Doyle's view of British fiction, but also into his obvious fascination with waterfalls while he was writing The Final Problem. And it became an even more fascinating read when I leafed through the notebook, Michael writes, to the end, and found 2 pages, penciled in Conan Doyle's hand, entitled The Methods of Sherlock Holmes.
Huh.
And what followed was the Sherlock Holmes examination paper as it was published in Tit-Bits in October 1893.
That is amazing. Right there in black and white. And in the Baker Street Journal, we have scans of those 2 pages of the notebook. And you can read in Conan Doyle's very neat handwriting these 12 questions that make up that examination paper.
Yeah. Now, there's a lot still we don't know. We don't know whose idea this was and, whether it was Greenhouse Smith. Well, of course, Greenhouse Smith was at the Strand. But George Nunes or some of his other editors approached Conan Doyle or Conan. I think that's more likely than Conan Doyle thinking that up himself, but maybe not.
Yeah, I mean that would prove quite interesting if we could find a paper trail of, perhaps letters, telegrams, etc., between Conan Doyle and Nunes to see who was prompting this. Was Conan Doyle questioning sales? Was Nunes pressing Conan Doyle to help with sales? This remains one of the uninvestigated areas of Sherlockiana. Meanwhile, that is Michael's paper, and it is more than worthy of a Morley-Montgomery Award. I mean, this is a wonderful discovery, and it's just if there was any Sherlockian to write this, it is Michael because of the connections to Switzerland.
Hear, hear. And folks, that's no trifle.
It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles.
Please join us again next week for another installment of Trifles. Show notes are available on SherlockHolmesPodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and be sure to check out our longer show, I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, where we interview notable Sherlockians and share news of the Sherlockian world.
You've taken my breath away, Mr. Holmes.
Well, of course, you have your own methods, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Not for me to say a word against them. But I think I've done a better day's work than you.